She grew up in a small town where dreams didn't come easy. People there worked hard just to get through the day. Her father fixed bicycles in a tiny shop that smelled of oil and iron, and her mother sold homemade bread in the local market. Life was simple, sometimes too simple, and there was never enough money to think about luxuries. But this girl, quiet, curious, always lost in her thoughts, had a dream that didn't match the place she came from. She wanted to play the piano. Not just as a hobby, not just for fun. She wanted to speak through music to touch people's hearts in a way words never could. There was only one piano in that whole town, sitting in the corner of the community hall. It was old, dusty, and missing a few keys. Sometimes when she pressed one key, two others made strange sounds. But to her it wasn't broken. It was beautiful. That piano was her friend. Every afternoon after finishing her chores, she would go there quietly. Sometimes she had to wait until the caretaker left. Sometimes she had to clean it before touching it. But when she sat down and placed her fingers on those rough keys, everything else disappeared. The piano wasn't tuned right, but her heart was. She didn't know how to read notes or follow rules. She just listened to the wind, the birds, the laughter outside, and somehow turned those feelings into music. Her melodies were soft, like whispers of dreams she couldn't say out loud. People from the town would pass by the hall and hear her playing. They would stop for a few moments, amazed that such sounds were coming from that old piano. No one had taught her. No one had believed it was possible, but she didn't need lessons. She needed heart, and that she had plenty of. Her parents noticed her love for music, but they couldn't do much. They barely earned enough for food and rent. Sometimes her father would come home tired, look at her and say, "You play that piano like you're telling it a secret." She would smile and keep quiet. How could she explain what she felt when she played? It was like all her worries melted away, leaving only peace. One evening, when she was playing a soft tune she made herself, an elderly man stopped outside the hall. He was the caretaker, a kind soul who had seen many kids come and go. He stood there listening for a long time. When she finished, he walked in slowly and said, "You play like someone who has lived 1,000 lives." She blushed and lowered her head. He smiled, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. "This," he said, handing it to her, "is something you should see." It was a flyer, an announcement about a piano competition in the city, only 2 weeks away. The prize was a scholarship for professional music training. The competition was open to anyone, but it was clear that most who joined came from rich families. She looked at the paper for a long moment. The hall was quiet, except for the faint echo of her last notes. She had never been to the city. She had never performed in front of people like that. The idea scared her, but somewhere deep inside, something whispered, "Go." That night, she showed the flyer to her mother. Her mother's hands trembled as she held it. "This could change your life," she said softly. "But how will we afford it?" Her father looked thoughtful. "Maybe some dreams are worth taking a chance for," he finally said. They sold a few things, her father's old tools, some handmade crafts her mother made, just enough for a bus ticket and a simple dress. When the day came, they packed her a small bag with a notebook, a piece of bread, and her mother's blessing. The journey to the city felt like entering another world. The buildings were tall, the roads wide, and everything seemed brighter and louder. She felt small among the crowds, clutching her bag tightly. When she reached the grand concert hall, she froze at the entrance. The building sparkled with chandeliers, mirrors, and golden walls. People were walking around dressed in fine clothes, laughing, chatting, adjusting their expensive instruments. She saw grand pianos shining under bright lights, instruments that looked like they came from dreams. She stood there quietly, watching. Her simple dress looked out of place, her shoes a little worn. A few people glanced at her, then looked away, whispering. She felt her heart sink a little, but she reminded herself why she was there. Not to impress anyone, but to play. When her name was called, she walked to the stage slowly. The lights were bright, and the judges sat in a line, serious and silent. She could hear her heartbeat echoing in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her hands. As she sat at the piano, she ran her fingers gently over the keys. They felt smooth, perfect, and strangely intimidating. She had never touched such a fine instrument before. The hall was silent. Some people in the audience looked curious, others amused. Maybe they thought she didn't belong there. She closed her eyes. For a second, she imagined she was back home in the old hall, sitting before the dusty piano that always waited for her. She could almost smell the wooden floor, hear the wind outside. Then softly she began to play. The first few notes were hesitant. Her hands trembled slightly, but then something changed. Her fingers began to move with confidence, faster, freer. The sound filled the hall, warm, emotional, alive. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling her story. Every sound carried a piece of her life. Her mother's smile, her father's tired hands, her quiet evenings alone with the broken piano. People in the audience began to lean forward, drawn in by the purity of her playing. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It came from somewhere deep, untouched by training or showmanship. It was the sound of a heart that had known both struggle and hope. The judges exchanged surprised looks. They had heard hundreds of performances, polished, technical, impressive, but nothing like this. Her music was raw and pure, full of emotion that words could never express. By the time she reached the final note, the hall was silent. Her hands rested on the keys, her chest rising and falling with every breath. For a few long seconds, no one moved. Then, one person began to clap, another joined, and soon the entire hall erupted in applause. She looked up, eyes wide, unsure if it was real. The judges smiled, the audience stood, and the sound of clapping filled the room. Tears welled in her eyes. She had dreamed of this moment, not the applause, but the feeling of being heard, truly heard. When she stood up and bowed slightly, her hands still shook, but not from fear, from disbelief. She had come from a place where dreams rarely came true, and yet here she was, standing under bright lights, being celebrated for something she had learned on a broken piano. As she left the stage, a woman in the front row whispered to her friend, "Who is she?" The friend shook her head. "I don't know, but that was something special." Backstage, she found a quiet corner and sat down. Her heart was still racing, her mind spinning. She didn't know if she would win or lose. It didn't matter anymore. For the first time, she felt free. Free from doubt. Free from fear. She had played her truth, and that was enough. Later, as the night ended and she stepped outside, the city lights shimmered above her. She looked up at the sky and smiled. Somewhere far away, her parents were probably waiting to hear how it went. She wished they could have seen it. The moment when the world finally listened to her heart. She walked back toward the bus stop, her small notebook in hand, humming the melody she had just played. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a promise that no matter where she came from, her dreams had a voice. And that voice had finally been heard. The applause from the hall echoed in her mind long after it ended. She sat on the bus back home, watching the city lights fade in the distance, still unsure if what happened was real. Her fingers rested on her lap, and she could still feel the piano keys beneath them, warm and alive. She didn't win that night, not officially. The judges gave the prize to someone else, someone from a famous academy. But that didn't bother her. Something much bigger had happened. People had listened to her music, really listened. That was worth more than any trophy. When she reached home early the next morning, her mother was waiting by the door, her eyes full of questions and worry. Before the girl could say anything, her mother hugged her tightly. "You did it, didn't you?" she whispered. I could feel it. Her father came out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on an old towel. "So," he said with a small smile, "did the city hear your song?" The girl laughed softly. "Yes, they did." For the next few days, things went back to normal, or at least they seemed to. She helped her mother in the market, cleaned the house, and went to the community hall to play the old piano again. But something had changed. Her music sounded different now. It carried new confidence, new strength. A week later, while she was practicing, the caretaker came rushing in, waving a newspaper. "Look at this," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. Right there on the front page of the culture section was her picture, taken during the performance. The headline read, "The Girl with the Broken Piano, a Melody That Silenced the Wealthy." She couldn't believe her eyes. The article described her story, the small-town girl who played without training, the one who made an entire audience cry with her pure emotion. It said her music reminded everyone that true beauty comes from the heart, not from perfection. By evening, people from nearby towns were talking about her. Some came to hear her play in the community hall. The old piano, once ignored and dusty, now felt like the center of attention. The girl was shy at first, but when she sat down to play, everything else disappeared again. One afternoon, a man in a suit arrived at the hall. He looked important, but his smile was kind. He introduced himself as someone who worked with a foundation that supported young talents. "I was there the night you performed," he said. "I haven't stopped thinking about your music since then." She stood quietly, unsure what to say. He continued, "We'd like to sponsor your musical education. Full scholarship. You deserve it." For a long moment, she didn't move. She thought she had misheard him. "You mean I can study music?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said with a warm smile. "At one of the best academies in the city. You have something rare, honesty in your sound. The world needs to hear it." Her eyes filled with tears as she nodded. That night she told her parents, and they both cried with her. Her father said quietly, "You see, hard work never goes to waste." Months passed. She moved to the city and started her studies. The first few weeks were hard. The lessons, the theory, the routines. Many students came from rich families, used to private tutors and expensive instruments. She often felt behind, but she never gave up. Every time she touched the piano, she remembered where she came from. The smell of her town, the sound of that broken instrument, the faces of her parents. That memory gave her strength. Her teachers were amazed at her progress. She practiced day and night, losing track of time. She didn't just play music. She lived inside it. When she performed, people could feel what she felt. Joy, pain, love, hope. It was like her soul spoke through every note. After a year, she received an invitation to perform at a grand charity gala. The event was hosted by the same wealthy families who had attended that first competition. The same people who had once whispered and laughed at her simple dress. Now they were inviting her as a guest of honor. When the day arrived, she stood backstage wearing a modest white gown gifted by her music school. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from emotion. The hall was even grander than she remembered. Golden lights, polished floors, and rows of elegantly dressed guests. As the announcer introduced her, the room fell silent. She walked to the piano with calm grace. People turned to look, some recognizing her, others curious to see the girl from the newspaper story. She sat down and closed her eyes. For a few seconds, she listened to her heartbeat. Then she began to play. The piece she performed was one she had written herself. It was called Home. The melody started softly like a whisper from the past. It carried memories of her small town, her parents' voices, and the sound of that old broken piano. As the music built, it spoke of her journey, the fear, the laughter, the long nights of practice, and the endless hope that kept her going. The audience sat completely still. The sound was pure, full of emotion, impossible to ignore. Even the richest guests, people used to luxury and perfection, felt something deep inside their hearts. The music wasn't fancy, it was human. Halfway through the song, tears began to roll down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. The notes flowed stronger, clearer, as if her soul was speaking directly through the keys. By the final note, the entire hall was silent again. Then came the applause. Loud, thunderous, unstoppable. People rose from their seats, clapping, cheering, some even crying. The same people who had once judged her now looked at her with admiration. The man who had offered her the scholarship sat in the front row, smiling proudly. She stood and bowed, her eyes glistening. It wasn't about fame or pride. It was about gratitude. Gratitude for the piano that taught her, for the people who believed in her, and for the struggles that shaped her. After the performance, reporters gathered around her asking questions. One of them said, "Your music touched everyone tonight. What's your secret?" She smiled gently and replied, "I just play what I feel. I think music should speak from the heart, not from the wallet." That line spread across newspapers and social media the next day. People from around the world shared her performance video, calling it a night to remember. Some said her music reminded them of their own dreams. Others said it made them cry. Weeks later, she returned to her hometown. The community hall was the same, old, dusty, but still standing strong. The caretaker, now much older, was sitting near the door. When he saw her, he smiled widely. "You made it," he said softly. She walked to the piano and touched the chipped keys. "I couldn't have done it without this," she said. "This piano was my first teacher." She sat down and played one last song for the small group of neighbors who had gathered to see her. The melody drifted through the air, gentle and warm, just like before. But this time the whole town listened. Children leaned near the door, old people smiled, and everyone felt proud. When she finished, there was silence, followed by soft clapping. It wasn't a grand hall or a fancy stage, but for her it was perfect. As she walked home that evening, the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky gold. She thought about everything, her fears, her struggles, her journey. She realized something important. It wasn't the grand pianos or big cities that made her who she was. It was love. The love she carried for her music, her family, and her roots. She understood that true success isn't about how big the stage is, but how deeply your song can touch someone's heart. And she had done just that. That night, as she sat by the window, she hummed the tune of Home Again. It had become her life's melody, simple, honest, unforgettable. The world would remember her as the girl whose piano performance left the wealthy in awe. But to her, she would always be the girl from the small town, the one who played not for fame but for love. And that made her story truly a night to remember,